From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform whole school mental health. Now, Jay, we are both still at home, which is probably our longest span of being at home since we started recording this. And so something that I've been thinking about at this busy time of year is rather than adding something to your routine to help you to flourish, is there something that you subtract that helps you to flourish?
I'd love to be subtracting a level of work from what I'm doing at the moment. It feels like I'm really sprinting to the finish line this season, which is unusual. Usually we're winding down around about now. Subtract. I'm very good at already saying no to stuff. You know, if you're in a school or in a community type group, if you say yes to something, often you get asked every single time, you know, will you do this? Will you do that? I've deliberately, because I've got so much going on with work and home life, it's like I just say no to everything anyway. So there's not much left for me to subtract tomorrow. But I did play tennis on Tuesday this week for the first time with a group of colleagues. That was actually great for my wellbeing. It was fantastic. Got to hit some balls at some people that I was angry with at work. So, and it was all on the court. It was all in good fun, right? But what about yourself? Are you subtracting anything at the moment?
I think I am. Yeah. Like you, I have good boundary setting around what I will say yes to and where I'm saying no. And I think what I'm trying to do, maybe rather than subtract, is to stack things together. So I'm trying to do my exercise while I'm in nature, while I'm listening to a podcast. So I'm getting layers of good things all at once. So it doesn't feel like more. It just feels like better. So I guess that's kind of subtraction.
That's a good tip. And that's the reason I got myself some waterproof headphones to wear so I could actually swim and listen to podcasts at the same time. So I'm learning and getting exercise. So there's cool things you can do like that. I'm all for that.
I would drown.
What, listening and swimming at the same time? Come on. Well, I guess, it'd be very cold, where you are most of the time if you're going to go for a swim. But here in
Although
there's
a lot of those polar bear swimmers that are running around my island right now, and it's freezing at the best of times in our water. I just don't get it.
Yeah, it's not for me. No.
That's another story. I'm going to introduce our guest, my good friend. I like to call you my good friend, Sue Easton. Sue and I first met at Ridley at a positive psychology conference that they were doing there. And Sue is currently the director of the Principal Training Center. She has a long history of training teachers and training principals, and I know that she has lived all around the world. So she and I, when I was working with the Geelong Grammar team, she knew Ron, who was the Middle East director of positive education when I was the Canada and US director. And so that was, all three of us were Canadian. And so it was a funny meeting of minds. And Sue has spent so much time with international schools, and as a person inside the school who has a deep heart about well-being and flourishing, and I'm going to let her talk about all the things that she has done in the past. But welcome, Sue.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And just to tell you, I cannot imagine swimming in Australia with headphones on, because I'm so focused when I swim there for sharks. So I would not be doing that.
I'm talking about lap swimming, Sue, not out in the ocean. So.
Thanks for clarifying that. So I'm Sue Easton. Thanks so much, Tamara, for introducing me. My career has had a lot of twists and curves. I started off in Canada, and I was a teacher and an administrator and a system-wide learning coordinator for 18 years in Ontario, including a year where I was in Australia doing a teacher's exchange in New South Wales, which was life-changing for me, actually. And then came back and stayed for a few years before my personal life changed, and I ended up running away to Barcelona and starting an entirely new career in international education, which has become my passion. And all of my roles while I was overseas were in relation to teaching and learning. So I had the great pleasure of beginning a role that's focused on adult education. And so when I got the opportunity, again, with my personal life changing, to come back to Canada and to work at Ridley College in the role of Director of Wellbeing, I ended up as Assistant Head of Wellbeing and Service and Global Learning. It was an extension of everything that I had learned overseas. And so the role that I'm in right now, which is Director of Programs for the Principals Training Center, the Counselors Training Center, the Teacher Leadership Institute as well, is an extension of that. And I feel like everything that I learned at Ridley, focusing on well-being, is really helping me in the role now, that everything that we do, we try to integrate well-being, because all of our courses are about leadership, and it's very important at a leadership level for there to be that focus on well-being as well.
That's, you've had quite the experience and quite the international experience, which is really amazing. What did you like most about your wellbeing role at Ridley?
Really good question. There are so many things that I liked about the role. I think the biggest one, and the one that I miss right now, is the opportunity to work with students. So I had a council called the Flourishing Council of students that represented each of the boarding houses, because we were a boarding school. And those students had the opportunity to work as an advisory group for me. But in addition to that, they were explicitly learning the pillars of well-being, according to Martin Seligman and Amelia Zhivatovskaya from the Flourishing Center, and to actually implement things into the boarding houses themselves. So it was a true pleasure to have multiple opportunities, but that was just my favorite one, to be able to work with students.
Yeah, I love it when students are given more agency around the wellbeing stuff, seeing as often it's something that's done to them rather than done with
Absolutely.
them. So I think that's a great example.
Thanks.
Can I ask you, Sue, in your current role, so you've shifted from working with students to working with school leaders. Can you tell me a bit about the background of the Principal Training Center for someone who isn't familiar with it, who maybe aspires to be in school leadership eventually?
So the mission statement of the Principals Training Center is to support international school educators who, in whatever role that they're in, are looking to have a more systemic lens of leadership. And so we offer courses to people who are either in headships or principals or aspiring roles, in addition to counselors and teacher leaders. So that's your department heads, your IB coordinators, all of those different roles as well. And the joy of being able to teach courses and do consulting, and we now are offering online as well as in-person courses, is that we're able to not only support them in leadership, but also to look at all the current issues that are happening. So well-being, of course, is something that has really risen in the last few years. But in addition to that, DEIJB, focus in schools, which really does impact well-being as well, has become another lens. So those two lenses being incorporated into all of our courses that we teach, in addition to offering a new course that is on DEIJB. And I'm actually going to be starting, and I think it's our third round of teaching a mental health and well-being course to our teacher leaders starting in February. All of those things have grown and changed as the needs of the international school community have grown and changed as well.
I can only imagine, and I know from the principals that I'm talking to that they feel sometimes a little bit alone. And so I imagine that gatherings like what you're talking about are exactly what they need. And my head's going back to you saying Barcelona and, oh, if I could gather with some other people in a beautiful place like this, wouldn't that just fill your cup to keep going? And so building on that idea, kind of the combination of these are the principles and they're going back to these schools. Can you think of something that has come out of your work, both in the well-being and the flourishing space, but also in helping these principals take it back to their school, that you've seen them do that has worked really well to shift a whole school in their flourishing, in their psychological health and safety at school?
It's a good question. And remember, I've only been back since September. However, I have the opportunity to not only talk to participants, but also to survey them. So I've sent out surveys to our principals, our teacher leaders, and our counselors about what is happening in relation to well-being in the international schools. And probably the biggest piece of information that I got was that 50% approximately are really taking a school-wide approach, that everyone is responsible, that it is not a counselor's role or a director of well-being's role, that it's everyone in the school who is responsible for this level of pastoral care and support. Whereas another 50% of the schools, it is predominantly the counselor that they are saying that is taking on the role. So that was very different for me from where I came from at Ridley, where it definitely was a school-wide approach and it was two-pronged. There was the proactive approach, which was explicit teaching to students of strategies to support their well-being in regards to the 6 pillars, in addition to a responsive approach of a pastoral team, which included counselors, heads of houses, teachers, coaches as well. So that felt very different to me, getting that response from international schools. And just the true range of approaches as well in the international schools, a lot talking about an SEL approach and using CASTLE or using Second Step, much less of a focus on positive education, which is what my background in is and what my passion is as well, and much less formal measurement. And I had the true pleasure of using Jason's tool, the Flourishing at School survey, and really found it impactful for students, because students were able to determine what were they doing that was contributing to their well-being and what could they do. Whereas what I've been hearing in international schools so far is that the measurement is mainly in numbers of counselor referrals and the differences between them, and then some school-made surveys as well. So it was just very clear to me that there's some great things going on, but there's also room for growth in the international schools that I surveyed.
I'm going to ask you a hard question that Jason asked me once, and I don't think that there's a right answer because I think these things have gotten very blended, but you mentioned SEL and you mentioned positive education. Can you tell me, in your perspective, in your understanding, what's the difference?
It's a good question, actually. For me, it often comes down to resources. So for positive psychology, the resources can differ, but they are based around a PERMA V or a PERMA H framework. Whereas SEL, what people are calling SEL, usually does not in any way reference the PERMA V framework, but refers more to the domains that are in the CASTLE framework or the Second Step approach. I feel like there's a different set of resources. I don't think they are contradictory. I think that they complement each other. I don't think everyone sees them as complementing each other. And I still think, unfortunately, that there are some misunderstandings around positive psychology, about it being the psychology of happy, happy, happy. And that is not the truth, as we all know. So I think there are many schools that are more comfortable with the SEL approach.
Thank you. For 2 reasons. One, because that was a really similar answer to the really bad one that I gave Jason when he asked me that question.
What, you're saying that Sue's response was
she's
bad?
just saying my answer is bad.
Love it.
I am. Let's offend the guests and then ask them another really hard question. No, I just think that it's really blurry. I know that UBC, their team calls what they do SEL. But when I look at it, other than not sitting clearly in the framework, so they're not maybe using exactly the lingo of positive education, it's all the same interventions. And they are talking whole school now, which used to be how I differentiated it. Was SEL to me appeared to go much more directly to the student and was about regulation and controlling behavior and removing things that were obstacles to learning, but not so whole student focused. And I've seen a shift in many people who are talking about SEL, and I think Cassell is doing great work, and they are looking at the teachers now, and it is becoming more of a whole school. And so the two seem much more similar. And so when Jason asked me that question, I was kind of tomato. It depends on, I think there's people who do positive education really well and get it right. And there's people who don't go deep and say they've checked that box and it doesn't work at all. And the same is true with SEL. And I do like the framework, but I also love the ability to go, we have PERMA V, but actually we can teach DEI, JB inside of that. And it's a different language, but it still fits in that framework. And so I think...
Agreed. I think what I would have said if I was answering when I was in my role at Ridley is the umbrella or the place that we're all heading is PERMA V, but there are different pathways to get there. The IB learner profile is one way to get there. The SEL, whatever it is that you are doing, is one way to get there. The search framework from Dr. Lee Waters is one way to get there. I think that would have been my answer then. So I'll go back to that tomorrow.
Awesome. We can agree that we both had excellent answers that weren't entirely clear.
And was there a second reason you liked that answer, Tamara?
Oh, yes. I think the first reason is because it kind of parroted mine, but I think the second was that you have this real clarity around the other things that are happening and how they connect, and you just drew it all together when you were talking about search and Cassell, and I've seen the ruler and the easel, and I think one of the challenges is when we start to get all these frameworks, it separates us rather than bringing us together. And so like you, I see positive education almost as a bigger umbrella. Justin Robinson and I used to say, if we've done our jobs well, we won't have jobs in 10 years because positive education will just be the new way that school works. And I still aspirationally hope that will be true.
I do agree with you too, that the jargon or the language sometimes gets in our way. Again, I remember when I started in my last job that there were so many different acronyms and different frameworks, and so I just thought it would be so great for us to pull them together. And how could we make a framework that is just ours? And we had some amazing discussions trying to get to that point. And at some point I realized it was the discussions that were the important thing. As long as we all knew that whatever we were doing, all these other things were all heading towards those contributors or pillars for well-being that we call PERMA V, then it didn't matter for us to have our own language with it. And that made a huge difference when I came to that conclusion.
Yeah, it's terrific to hear. Yeah, it's all about, in service of the same goals, right? We want happy, productive students now, but also in giving them skills into adulthood as well to assist them to stay well and to flourish.
Absolutely.
There's obviously a lot of things that you've done well in your career, Sue, and things that you've tried that have had the desired impact. Are there any things that you'd like to share with our listeners about what didn't work well, like something that you tried that maybe you failed horribly?
I think the number one ruler or benchmark for me is the student rolling eye test. I would even say this for adults as well. And we started with a student course at Ridley that was called Flourishing 101 for grade 9s and Flourishing 104 for grade 11s. And the idea was explicit teaching of strategies with opportunities for them to experience them. Might not have been ideal that it was a boarding school and we did it on Saturday mornings, not the ideal time for students. But the rolling eye test for me, I struggled every time. How can we make things more engaging so that they are getting the lessons, but they're having the opportunity not just to learn it, but to live it, just using that DeLong framework. And the best day I remember was when we changed everything and we, instead of doing sort of a lecture with an activity approach, we did a station approach. And so all over the school, they had to run to different stations. So there was action in between, and there was a very short little sort of mini lesson so that they understood the research or the why behind things. And then they did something, whether it was doing a meditation together or whether it was seeing how fast they could run for the vitality piece. But that change got rid of the rolling eyes. And so that was a big learning for me. So a failure that ended up being something that was meaningful.
Yeah, thinking back to my student days, I couldn't think of anything worse but to go, here's some more things that we're going to teach you, and putting that into a formal classroom structure. So, I guess the learning from that, making it experiential and making it not feel like just more classwork.
Absolutely.
I really like that. And I'm also thinking back to an earlier guest in an earlier conversation when we said that sometimes they learn despite the eye rolls. And so you are right in the eye rolls and the behavior and the disengagement as signs that, okay, we want them to not be eye rolling. And we did note that learners still got stuff even when they were rolling their eyes, because I think we don't want teachers who are hearing this and starting out thinking, well, it only works if they're not rolling in their eyes. But I do love what you were saying about how active and how responsive you were to what they needed. And you're right. It should not feel like one more thing to. I remember going to St. Michael's University School and being asked to work with the grade 10s, doing a happiness project. And when I sat down with these students, I realized really quickly what they actually needed more than one more project was a nap, a break, a rest, to go outside in nature. And so we tried whatever we could to make it such a low-key project that it could be on your phone, go and take pictures of 10 things that somehow energize you. So super low-key. And I think that's that subtraction thing again, right? It doesn't have to be a formal project where you're presenting it in front of your peers and being judged and winning something. It can simply be, did you pause? Did you breathe? Taking it down a notch.
And I think the message from that is still explicit instruction. If there's one thing that I would still say is the number one message, whether there's rolling eyes or not, is that students, kids and adults need explicit instruction in what are some strategies that fill your bucket. What are the things that you can do to calm yourself down, the things to excite you, the things to get you so you are more motivated. I think that is such a huge message, that there are some people who think, well, just give them all kinds of fun, wonderful experiences. And that is not going to necessarily transfer into lifelong practices that they can do whenever they're feeling anxious or stressed.
Yeah, and so I agree with that you need some explicit instruction. Just need to make sure that if you're a whole psych geek or a science nerd, then you don't overwhelm kids with too much of the science. Yeah. But start with the why. What does the science say? But don't spend too much time on it. You still need that experiential stuff to get through to kids.
Agreed. And have it available, though, because there are students that really dig into the research. And one of my favorite things that happened at Ridley, and the kids definitely don't think that there is any connection between the two, but the students in grade 12 who were prefects, which is kind of like the student council, they each had the opportunity to do a prefect speech during chapel time, which is kind of like an assembly. It's not always a formal religious ceremony. And in the 3 years that I was there, more and more, the prefect speeches became things that were related to well-being strategies. So I remember one that was all about grit. Remember one that was all about growth mindset. So again, with the explicit instruction, exactly what you were saying, Tamara, that just because they're rolling their eyes doesn't mean they're not taking things in. And kids need the opportunity to go deeper if they are interested. And if they are not, as you said, Jason, then it's enough to do a little bit and give them the experience to take away. Yeah, I definitely agree.
That's some great tips. I hope that our audience is writing these furiously, because I think we've got some great ideas for students. And I want to shift gears a little bit and go back to the leaders, because I know when we talk about a whole school well-being or mental health concept idea, I don't like calling it a program, because that makes you think it's something that finishes, and it just doesn't, right? It's an evolving philosophy and ethos, whatever you want to call it. The leaders are often at the top. And I know we've heard a lot of experts say you have to start at the top and the bottom and let it meet in the middle somehow. But can you think of something that happens when a leader is flourishing that helps the whole school to come along? I would love to hear more, because I have worked with whole schools, but I've very rarely met the leader before the school is immersed. So can you tell me a little bit more about what this looks as a leader is learning about PERMA V, PERMA H?
To me, and a lot of this comes from my experience at Ridley, which is transferring to the teaching that I do now. It is the constant conversation and the constant modeling. So the head of school at Ridley, Ed Kidd, is absolutely passionate about the mission statement, which is inspiring flourishing lives to transform our globe. The fact that I know that still a year out, it was alive. Every conversation with him, every time that he spoke in front of the community, he talked about what that looked like, sounded like, and felt like of leading a good life. And he was constantly researching things and sharing and recommending, have you read this book? And I've got this book for you. I think this would be good. And building it into structures to ensure that everyone understood how important it was. So, for example, we had a leadership team that was every leader from operational to academic, etc. And as part of my role, I was given time every week to do some sort of positive leadership activity to ensure that it was at the forefront of people's minds. And it wasn't meant to be an activity that we just did as a group and had a reflection. The idea was that we were modeling something that they could then take back to their teams and do. So the filtering down, and we used Kim Cameron's work from University of Michigan. His game, positive leadership game, was absolutely fantastic. I brought that with me to the PTC as an activity that we do now with our principals training center. And just everything that we do needs to have that lens to look at it through. And that's what leaders do who focus on it.
That makes so much sense. And I'm thinking, I know Ed, and he embodies all things flourishing. And I think that the real key, the nugget in what you said was the role modeling, because I have a lot of leaders that I've run across who have all the books and say all the things, and they don't have great balance in their own life, and they aren't role modeling it, even though they understand it in a cognitive way, they're not living it. It's that learn, live, teach, embed, that process of really having it in the tapestry of the school. And I think one challenge is having it in the tapestry in such a way that when there's a change of leadership, it sticks. I wonder if you have any tips that you can think of that would help for a transitioning leader to keep running with somebody else's baton.
And that is the challenge of leadership in international education, because I don't know what the average is right now, but a few years ago, the average for heads of school was less than 3 years. They are the only employee that is hired by a board, and everybody else is their employee, and there is a lot of turnover. So sustainability in structures is absolutely key, that the head of school doesn't own it, that people in the school are empowered to lead these structures. That would be the first thing, is to ensure that there are people who are the lead in whatever it is that is your focus, well-being, DEIJB, et cetera. The second thing would be in the hiring of the new leader, that it is a component of the search process, that the recruiting questions include, what are examples of what you are currently doing that embody it in your life? What have you done in your school? The most distressing thing is to hire someone who has never had any interest in a direction that your school has totally bought into. So I really think the empowering of the people who are staying and the recruiting of somebody who has the same values and same beliefs is key.
So I think all of our listeners will listen to, the input that you've given today on the podcast and the things that you've done over the last number of years and think, wow, she knows a lot. But I think that's due to your love of learning. So besides this podcast, are there any other podcasts that you're listening to or books that you've read recently that you could point our listeners to expand their learning?
Yes. So I have to say, I always go back to Stephen Covey's work, where he said, to really believe in what you're doing, you have to have opportunities in your job to live, love, learn, and leave a legacy. Those are the 4 things. And I think of that with the resources that I fill, my time with. And so I have to throw out there that I'm type 1 diabetic. My number 1 podcast is the Juice Box podcast. And why? Because it's about helping me live better with diabetes, but it's also connected me with a community. So that's really important as well. But on this topic, I am addicted to all things Adam Grant. So Rethinking and Work Life, 2 of my favorites. I love Dear Sugars. I was devastated when they stopped. It's about relationships. It's such a key. And then I also love Freakonomics because I learn something every single time. So those would be the podcasts. I was thinking about the resources. I am a huge Flourishing Center / Center for Pause Ed fan, and any course that they offer, and they offer so many amazing learning opportunities. I would just highly recommend, from the positive education certificate that they offer to certificate of applied positive psychology. I would highly recommend them. I also recommend all things Laurie Santos. So she has a course right now on Coursera that is free, The Science of Happiness, from Yale University. But I like, even just going on YouTube, anything that Laurie Santos does, the way she presents it is useful for students as well as for adults as well. I already talked about Kim Cameron's game for leaders, really powerful. And then I have to throw out some tech. So Muse, the technology that you put on your head, and it helps train your brain to calm down. We piloted it at Ridley before I left, and I had the kids on the Flourishing Council all try it out and give their feedback. And it was powerful. The whole idea of them recognizing themselves that they have the ability to calm themselves down. So I would highly recommend Muse for kids as well. So those
I'll have to look into that. I love tech, so
yeah, Muse is really cool. Way back in the day, Deepak Chopra had a game called Wild Divine, and it actually had sensors that you put your fingers in. And so it would help you to meditate much in the way that Muse is, but it also looked at bringing up your energy, which was one that I loved to practice. And it was really interesting. My kids were just intuitive at it. They would put their fingers in, and it would be something like the game would say, if you needed to raise your energy, you had to light a fire, and it would give you a little spark. And
I love it.
You could do whatever you needed to do to bring up your energy. And I remember my daughter, when she was about 5, just sitting there staring at it and watching this fire just go poof, that I would sit there for hours and I'd be like trying to energize myself, a little tiny flame, and my daughter was just like boom, like oh. So I think anything like that, right, that has that biofeedback really makes that tangible. That's a great recommendation. I've forgotten about it and I'm going to put it back on my shopping list. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our formal questions. Before I wrap up, is there anything that you didn't get a chance to mention that you would love to?
I don't think so. I think we actually hit pretty much everything and all of the resources that I wanted to share. No, I think we're good.
Well, thank you for generously sharing your knowledge and your experience and a great list of resources. We will make sure to share those out with the entire audience. And so that brings us to the end of another episode of the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm reminding our listeners that you can also watch us on Flourish DX YouTube channel. And we will be sharing out some of our favorite snippets on LinkedIn. You can find us all on LinkedIn, and we love to interact with you there. And that's it for today. Until the next episode, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.